Let me start with something concrete. Not a theory, an actual object you can look up right now. It sits in a museum in Berlin with a catalogue number, cylinder seal VA243. Sumerian, roughly 4,000 years old. It was classified as a standard artifact and shelved alongside thousands of others. Nothing remarkable, but there is another object, and it is considerably harder to explain. A tablet from Nippur, a series of medical texts dated to approximately 2000 BC, held at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. These tablets, administrative and medical documents, not epics, not religious hymns, systematically describe processes that modern biology identifies with very specific terminology. Terminology that did not exist until the middle of the 20th century. The mixing of blood, the formation of a being inside a vessel, the creation of a worker with defined characteristics, not in a poetic sense, with sequential steps, with deliberate distinctions between terms. The official position, mythology, poetic language describing the creation of man by the gods. Perhaps. I am not ruling that out. But here is the question I want you to hold as we go further. Poets do not distinguish between the blood that is passed to offspring and blood as a fluid. In Sumerian, there are two different words for these two different things, two distinct concepts, deliberately separated. Who made that distinction 6,000 years ago? And why have we still not asked that question out loud? That is what this video is about. Sumerian civilization emerged in southern Mesopotamia around the 4th millennium BC. That is not contested, it is academic consensus. They invented writing. They created the first legal codes. They built cities with sewage systems at a time when most of the world had no concept of permanent settlement. But there is one aspect of the Sumerian legacy that standard academic courses on ancient history move through quickly and without pause. Their texts about the origin of the human being. The Enuma Elish, the Sumerian creation epic written across 7 tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature. The Atrahasis, a text describing the creation of humans by the Anunnaki gods, specifically to perform physical labor. These texts are studied. They have been translated. They are available. But here is what tends to get lost in those translations, or more precisely, interpreted in the direction of least resistance. In the Atrahasis, the process of creating a human being goes like this. The gods take clay. They mix it with the blood of a slain god. They place the mixture inside a vessel. After a set period of time, a being is removed from the vessel with defined characteristics, able to work, to obey, to reproduce. The official interpretation, metaphor. Clay represents the earth. The blood of a god represents the divine spark in human nature. Standard mythological imagery. But here is the detail that the metaphorical interpretation does not satisfactorily explain. The Atrahasis does not describe a single creation attempt. It describes several. The first attempts fail. The beings that come out are defective. The gods adjust the process. They change the proportions. They change the materials. Only after several iterations do they get a result they are satisfied with. 3 attempts is a universal structure in mythology. The hero faces 3 trials, 3 riddles, 3 roads, 3 brothers. That is well known and well explained. But in the Atrahasis, it is not simply 3 attempts. The specific defects of each failed version are listed. Blindness, missing limbs, non-functioning reproductive organs. Each defect named. Each version with its own specific pathology. Mythological attempts do not catalogue pathologies. They describe failure as failure. A technical process describes the defect precisely, because precision is what makes correction possible. So here is the question that follows. Why did the author of this text need that level of detail, if he was simply retelling a story about gods? There is an argument I hear every time this subject comes up, and it sounds convincing right up until you actually start checking it. The argument goes like this. Sumerian is a dead language. Translations are approximate. Interpretations are subjective. And any researcher can read whatever they want into these texts. That is a fair warning. I accept it. But here is the problem. Sumerian is not some poorly understood or barely deciphered language. It is one of the most thoroughly documented dead languages in the history of linguistics. The Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, an academic project built over decades and completed in 2006, contains detailed records of how every significant term is used across the full corpus of surviving texts. This is not a popular reference work. It is the tool that professional Assyriologists use. And here is what that corpus records, without any conspiratorial interpretation whatsoever. In Sumerian, the term tea means both rib and life simultaneously. This documented semantic duality was identified by Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the foremost Sumerian language scholars of the 20th century. It is the same duality that appears in the biblical account of Eve being created from Adam's rib, a text written at least 1,000 years after the Sumerian sources it clearly draws from. In Sumerian, the term Lulu refers to a being created through mixing. Not born, not grown, created, mixed. It is a technical term, not a poetic image. It appears in administrative texts, in medical texts, in texts that categorize types of beings, not only in epics. In Sumerian, there is a distinction between dam, blood as a biological fluid, and zi, that which is transmitted through blood to offspring, the life force that is inherited. This distinction is recorded in the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary in the entries for both terms. It is not an interpretation, it is a lexical fact. Modern biology calls what is transmitted from parent to offspring through biological material genetic information. That concept entered science in the middle of the 20th century. The distinction between blood as a fluid and what blood carries to the next generation existed in the Sumerian language 4,000 years before that. Poets do not create technical terms for phenomena they have not observed. Terminology is built to describe reality. And the question that follows is this: what exactly were the people who built these terms into their language actually observing? That is what the next block is about. I want to be precise about what I can and cannot claim in what follows. The Anunnaki. Anyone who has spent time with Sumerian material knows this word, and knows that it carries so much interpretive baggage that it becomes difficult to have a straightforward conversation about what the Sumerian texts actually say about them, as opposed to what popular authors say about them. I am not claiming the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials. That claim requires evidence that does not exist. Here is what the Sumerian texts say about the Anunnaki, without any exotic interpretation. The Anunnaki are beings who possess knowledge unavailable to humans. They are described through a verb of arrival, not creation. They existed before humans. They created humans for a specific purpose, to free themselves from the physical labor of resource extraction. And at some point they depart from the territory where the described events took place, again through a verb of movement, not disappearance. This is not a creation metaphor in any standard religious sense. In standard religious cosmogony, gods create humans out of love or divine intention. In the Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki create humans because they are tired of digging. That is pragmatism, not theology. And here is the detail I cannot reconcile with standard interpretation. In the texts describing the creation of the first humans, the Anunnaki run experiments. They do not succeed on the first attempt. They produce beings with pathologies, described specifically, named individually, with the nature of each defect stated. These beings are listed in the text. Then the process is adjusted, and finally they produce Adapa, the first functional human. Adapa in the Sumerian texts is not Adam in the sense of a poetic first ancestor of all humanity. Adapa is a prototype, the first successful result after a series of failed ones. Those are different narrative functions, and the difference matters. I do not know who the Anunnaki were, but the language used to describe what they did is the language of a laboratory, not the language of a temple. I want you to hold that distinction, because in the next block it becomes considerably more specific. In 2003, the Human Genome Project was completed, the first full mapping of human DNA, a real scientific event with real results published in Nature and Science. Among the findings that received significant attention in academic genetics in the years that followed was the identification of a group of genes called HARs, Human Accelerated Regions. These are sections of the genome that changed with anomalous speed in the human evolutionary lineage, far faster than standard models of evolutionary pressure would predict. HAR1, the most studied of these, is linked to the development of the cerebral cortex. In chimpanzees, it has remained essentially unchanged for 300 million years of evolution. In the human lineage, it changed rapidly and dramatically. The official explanation? Natural selection. Cognitive ability conferred survival and reproductive advantages, so the genes supporting it developed faster. That is a sound explanation within the available data. I am not disputing it. But here is what I notice alongside it. In the Sumerian texts describing the creation of Adapa, the first functional human after a series of failed versions, there is a specific moment in which the created being receives something called ME. The Sumerian term ME is rendered in academic translations as divine formulas or attributes of civilization. These are not physical objects, they are transferable qualities. Without ME, the created being is functional, but limited in its capacity for development and the accumulation of knowledge. With ME, it becomes capable of civilization. I am not claiming that ME and HAR are the same thing. That claim would require evidence that does not exist. But I am asking you to consider the following comparison honestly. Modern science describes a group of genes that changed with anomalous speed and that are linked to the cognitive capacities that distinguish humans from our closest primate relatives. A Sumerian text describes a moment in which a created being receives qualities that make it capable of civilization, as a separate act, a separate element, not part of the base creation process. The two systems are structurally parallel. That is not proof, but it is not a coincidence that can be dismissed with the word mythology. The Sumerians are not alone in this. And that is what turns the question from a local historical anomaly into a pattern that becomes harder to explain as accident. The Vedic texts, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata, describe beings called Devas and Asuras, who possess knowledge unavailable to humans, and who at some point in history were actively involved in human affairs before withdrawing. The descriptions of Vimanas in the Mahabharata, flying vehicles with specific technical characteristics, appear in a text academically dated to the 4th century BC, but drawing on sources that are considerably older. The author of those descriptions was reproducing what was in his sources. He did not have the conceptual framework to invent those details from scratch. The Egyptian texts, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, systematically describe the gods as beings who came from beyond the horizon. The Egyptian term Ak, in texts dealing with the transformation of the body, carries a technical context that does not fit standard descriptions of the afterlife. It describes transformation as a process, not a state. The Mayan text Popol Vuh describes the creation of humans as a series of failed experiments. First from mud, does not work. Then from wood, partially works, but the beings lack memory and emotional connection. Then from maize, finally works. This is not the standard folkloric structure of 3 attempts. In each version, a specific defect is recorded and becomes the basis for the next iteration. 3 traditions. 3 independent written sources in 3 different languages from 3 different parts of the world. 1 structure. Beings with superior knowledge. A series of iterations to create a human. Specific defects recorded in each failed version. A final version that works. Is diffusion of this narrative between traditions possible? Between the Sumerian and Vedic? Yes, through Indo-European contact. Between those and the Mayan? That connection has not been established. 3 independent records of the same structure require an explanation. And the explanation that mainstream scholarship prefers not to engage with seriously is that all 3 traditions were describing the same event. There is someone I want to mention here, and I want to mention him precisely. Zecharia Sitchin, author of the Earth Chronicles series, beginning with the 12th planet in 1976. The first person to systematize the Sumerian texts in popular form around the thesis of extraterrestrial origins for the Anunnaki. The official academic position on Sitchin: his specific translations contain errors, his interpretations do not hold up under professional textual scrutiny, his work is not an academic source. That is fair criticism. Professional Assyriologists have identified real errors in his handling of specific texts. But what I find more interesting than Sitchin's errors is this: the academic response to him was not a refutation of his central thesis. It was a classification of that thesis as not worth examining. Those are 2 different intellectual actions. To refute a thesis is to demonstrate that it is wrong. To classify it as unscientific is to deny it the process of verification. There is not a single paper in peer-reviewed Assyriology that systematically compares Sumerian biological terminology in the creation texts with modern biological nomenclature and formulates a testable hypothesis about the possible technical content of those terms. Not asserting, formulating for testing. Standard scientific procedure. That paper does not exist. The astronomical content of the same tablets is studied with the full range of modern scientific methodology. The MUL.APIN series has been analysed by modern astronomers, and the results published in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal for the History of Astronomy. Sumerian mathematics is studied with the same rigour. The biological content of the same text corpus is classified as mythology and analysed accordingly. That is not the same standard applied to the same body of material. It is 2 different standards, and the choice of which standard to apply to which content is not a neutral methodological decision. Let me tell you not what we have, but what we do not have. That is a different conversation, and often a more honest one. We do not have a single peer-reviewed study that systematically compares Sumerian biological terminology, DAM, ZI, Lulu, Me, with modern genetic nomenclature and formulates a testable hypothesis about the possible technical content of those terms. Not because such a study is technically impossible, because no one has funded it. We do not have an analysis of the list of defective beings in the Atrahasis, the blind ones, the limbless ones, the beings with non-functioning organs, cross-referenced against known phenotypic pathologies that arise from specific types of errors in directed biological modification. That comparison would either produce a result or it would not. It has not been attempted. We do not have a comparative linguistic analysis of Sumerian biological terms conducted with the same rigor as the comparative analyses of Sumerian astronomical and legal terminology, analyses whose published results we have and use. The silence in this space does not feel like the silence of absence. It feels like the silence of a boundary, a line that the academic discipline prefers not to cross, not because there is nothing interesting on the other side, but because what might be there carries implications that are harder to manage than the results of astronomical tablet analysis. This is not a conspiracy. It is institutional logic. Disciplines protect their boundaries, and once you start seeing exactly where this particular boundary runs, you start seeing it everywhere it runs. In 2012, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier described the CRISPR-Cas9 mechanism, a tool for directed genome editing that allows precise changes to be made to the DNA of a living organism. In 2020, they received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for it. CRISPR changed biology fundamentally. It made directed genome modification practically achievable in any well-equipped laboratory. Before CRISPR, this was theoretical. After CRISPR, it has been routine practice for 10 years. I am not saying the Sumerians had CRISPR. That would be an absurd claim. Here is what I am saying. 100 years ago, the structure of DNA was unknown. The very existence of a molecule carrying hereditary information had not been demonstrated. 50 years ago, directed genome editing was science fiction. 10 years ago, it became routine. The entire distance, from not knowing what DNA is to editing it on demand, took less than 100 years. Now here is the question I am asking you to consider honestly. If our civilization traveled that distance in under a century, what does that say about what is theoretically possible across 6,000 years of another civilization's development? A civilization we only know through what it chose to record, and only through what survived from that record, and only through what we have decided to interpret seriously. The early Sumerian period, the Ubaid culture, the Uruk period, the early dynastic period, spans several thousand years of gradual development that academic archaeology documents in real detail. That is a real history with real stages. But here is what remains unexplained within that real history. The level of technical precision in Sumerian medical and biological texts does not match the level of material culture we observe in the same period. The medical tablets from Nippur describe procedures with a degree of precision that is excessive for a civilization without a microscope and without any concept of the cell. Excess precision in description is a marker of transmission, not invention. When someone invents something, they feel their way forward. When someone transmits what they received, they reproduce it with the accuracy of the source. The Sumerians themselves explained where their knowledge came from. They said they were taught. They named who taught them. They wrote it on clay. They fired the clay, and they put it in the ground. Where that knowledge is now, and what exactly it contained, that is the next block. I do not know who the Anunnaki were. Nobody does. Not really. Not with evidence that closes the question. I do not know whether the process described in the Atrahasis was a real procedure or a poetic image. I do not know whether the Sumerian word Z meant what we today call genetic information, or whether that is simply two concepts from 4,000 years apart being placed next to each other. But here is what I do know. The Sumerian texts exist. They have been translated. They sit in museums with catalogue numbers and in academic editions with footnotes on every page. and they contain material that, read honestly, without a prior decision that it must be mythology, describes processes that are structurally consistent with what modern biology calls directed modification of a living organism. I know that the academic discipline which studies these texts applies a different standard of interpretation to their biological content than it applies to their astronomical or legal content. Astronomy in the same tablets is science worthy of serious study. Biology in the same tablets is mythology not worthy of testing. I know that studies directly comparing Sumerian biological terminology with modern genetic nomenclature do not exist in the peer-reviewed literature. Not because the result is already known, because the question has not been asked. And I know that over the last 20 years, science has identified human accelerated regions in the human genome, genes that changed with anomalous speed, linked to the cognitive capacities that set humans apart from our nearest primate relatives. Mainstream science explains these anomalies in good faith, within the tools available to it. But there is a text written 4,000 years ago in which someone described a moment when a created being was given the qualities that made it capable of civilization. As a separate act, a separate element, after a series of failed versions. That text is in a museum in Philadelphia. It has a catalogue number. Anyone can read it. And here is the question I leave you with. Not an accusation, not a conclusion, a question. If tomorrow a geneticist and an Assyriologist sat down together and read the Atrahasis side by side, applying to its biological content the same standard that astronomers applied to the Sumerian astronomical tablets, what exactly would they find? That experiment has never been run, not once. In 170 years of Sumerian scholarship, ask yourself why.